All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Antebellum Idealism and Reform Impulses, 1820 to 1860. We'll be looking at Section 1, An Awakening of Religion and Individualism. So this chapter, recall, you probably know this term by now, antebellum simply just means before the Civil War. Before the Civil War. And, some of the changes that are taking place, really focusing on the years between 1820 and 1860. So let us just recall that both in the North and the South, that there are some significant changes happening. Just to list them, we could say in the North, everything that has to do with the Industrial Revolution, and in the South, the cotton boom. And these two changes are not completely separate from one another. In fact, they feed into one another. But the North and the South, between these years 1820 to 1860, do become more different than one another. And because society has changed, that also means that ideas change. And it also means that there's new problems, right? To reform means to change. And so now societies are dealing with problems kind of in a very new way. And you see, especially in the years before the Civil War, a variety of different ways that people sought to solve those problems. So one thing that's also underlying a lot of the culture and society here is another Great Awakening. Recall the Great Awakening is just any sort of, again, just looking at the Great Awakening part, any sort of massive religious revival. It's defined by more people going to church, more Bibles being sold, church attendance increasing. There had been a first Great Awakening right before the American Revolution. The second Great Awakening here again is just referring to this second sort of time period. So we might just identify as the second Great Awakening from happening anywhere from the 1810s to maybe roughly the 1840s or something like that, maybe even the 1850s. And in short, you could say that because there was a lot changing in society, people looked towards stability. That would, of course, would be church and and things like the Bible. So some of the things that made the Second Great Awakening similar to the First Great Awakening, if you recall that, is the emphasis on emotion. That religion, and this is kind of a good way of thinking about Great Awakenings. Religion is a matter of the heart. Oops. Heart, not the mind. In other words, somebody as part of this great awakening would say that religion has to do more with feeling, more with emotion, than it has to do with thinking and rationality and education. One thing that might mark the Second Great Awakening as being more unique and different from the first is this emphasis on personal salvation. Personal salvation is essentially the idea that one can be born again, that in a, even if one had lived a life of sin, they had the individual power to change course and become saved again or achieve salvation. This message of personal salvation, the idea that one has the power or the control to choose their, to not choose their destiny, but to act in a way that makes their destiny fulfilled, that is going to heaven. This is very much in line with the spirit of individualism. Recall that this is going on against the backdrop of growing democratic political participation. It's the age of Jacksonian democracy, and the Second Great Awakening really lines up with that in a very neat way. The spirit of individualism and tied to Jacksonian democracy. We might also call this a rejection of predestination, right? And that was kind of an old Puritan and Calvinist sense that one was predetermined, but again, the idea that one can do the right thing even in a life of sin, be born again, and achieve salvation. And so the Great Awakening, it spread, rapidly across the United States, and, it affected a number of areas, including reform movements, which we'll get to in a little bit. I would say that's kind of the point of learning about the Second Great Awakening here, is that, it sort of underlines or provides a foundation for a lot of other reform movements that are born, many reform movements in the United States being based in this type of Christianity that becomes much more popular. But some other ways that it sort of shaped the United States was a growing rise in millennialism. Millennialism is the idea that a kingdom of God would be established on earth. All right, so this is a group of Christians in the United States. It also had the effect of increasing Christianity, really amongst everyone, including the enslaved population. So we might say that more slaves and African Americans became Christian as a result of the Second Great Awakening. But we also need to keep in mind that there was a difference between the type of Christianity that was practiced by slave masters or slave holders and the type of Christianity that was practiced by enslaved people. So, for example, we might just say about master theology, it was really about emphasizing things like obedience. And for, slaves or enslaved people, it was more about the idea of good versus evil. It was about emphasizing figures like Moses as opposed to Jesus Christ. And it was based off of this idea of, spiritual equality. So even though we can just sort of lump these two together and say that on the one hand, most enslaved people in the United States by the time of the Civil War were Christians, and most slave holders were Christians, it wasn't exactly the same type of Christianity. We could also see the Second Great Awakening helping contribute or help grow the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the first independent black church, say black Protestant church to be in the U.S. And Richard Allen, who you see pictured right here, was the head minister of that. Very early on, churches were integrated. There were some of the very first integrated institutions really in the United States. There's not very many really in the antebellum era, but it became segregated. Not short after that. Maybe in the 1790s, 1800s, 1810s, you might be able to find some integrated churches, both black and white, but they become increasingly segregated. And so you have independent black churches being established in the very, very early years, the Methodist Episcopal Church being one of the earliest ones. So the Second Great Awakening spread Christianity far and wide. It created very popular / celebrity preachers. Charles Finney, probably the most well-known second, we'll just say GA, Great Awakening preacher. And when the Second Great Awakening spread over a particular area, it was said that the message of Christianity, the emotional emphasis, the emphasis on personal salvation, that it spread so quickly that it burned over the country like a wildfire of sorts. And so a burned over district was described as an area which was heavily influenced by the second, again, GA, stand for Great Awakening. I'll scroll down a little bit here, right? It says, a good, not God versus evil. I guess technically it would be God versus evil, but good versus evil. So now that you can see that, right? So master theology, emphasizing obedience; enslaved theology, emphasizing notions of good versus evil; Moses, and spiritual equality. So think about the Second Great Awakening maybe as kind of the bedrock for many reforms in antebellum period. Many reforms in the antebellum period. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening is much more popular, it's emotional, it's religious, but there were also other movements. Transcendentalism. This was less of a religious movement, although you might describe it like that, but more of an intellectual movement. It was not as widespread. It was, mostly popular amongst a select group of elites. Transcendentalism, in short, it has the root word transcendent. It really means to transcend. We might say the quote-unquote rational or sensory aspects of society. Transcendentism was a huge movement that really stressed individualism. Right, that's a big theme. Really not conform with the rest of society. Thinking about society, especially in the way that, think about how it changed farmers into factory workers, almost made work this boring, repetitive, sort of mechanized process. There was very strong social pressure to reform, or conform, I should say. And Transcendentalism said, no, there's something much more beyond that. So they stressed individualism, they stressed emotions, right? There's much more to this sort of rational world. And they stress things like nature, especially this notion of returning back to nature, that with industrial society, the concrete jungles, the factories, the smokestacks, that humans kind of lost touch with nature and then should kind of go back in, and revisit it, so to speak. Amongst the most important transcendentalists was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote such works as Nature, again, sort of emphasizing this point. Also self-reliance, the idea of trying to be independent in a society in which people are so reliant. Again, think about the way that farmers lost sort of that, or many people in the United States lost that independence by going from, let's say farming on an individual plot of land that was self-owned to working in a factory and making wages. You essentially become a wage slave, as they called it. Henry David Thoreau was also another very important transcendentalist thinker. He wrote or talked about civil disobedience. This is sort of a message of nonviolence to follow. To refuse to follow immoral laws. Right? What can just one single individual do as part of a immoral and corrupt society? Henry David Thoreau said, just simply don't follow those laws as an individual, and that's the way to, sort of, dismantle the system, so to speak, or that's, all that one individual can do. This message of civil disobedience later on gets accepted or really taken up by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mohandas Gandhi in India. Henry David Thoreau, what he was responding to was the Mexican-American War. He believed that the Mexican-American War was unjust, and so he refused to pay his taxes, not wanting his money to go to this unjust cause, and he was thrown in jail for it. Thoreau was also known for writing Waldo. This is his effort to live in a cabin away from society and try to reconnect back with nature, reconnect back with the individual. Some other important transcendentalist writers include Margaret Fuller, who was a transcendentalist, also a woman. She wrote about women's equality in a transcendentalist way. And Walt Whitman, who was maybe the most famous poet in American history, certainly of this period, maybe all of American history. And he wrote poems, again, emphasizing these themes about nature, about individualism and trying to, sort of criticize, you might say, modern industrial society.